Hello and welcome back to the Christian Century YouTube channel. I'm John and I'm joined today, as you can see, by two guests, one of our online columnists, Mac Loftin, along with scholar Hannah Strømmen, the two of them will be talking about the Bible and politics. Mac wrote a recent piece for us called How Politicians Use the Bible, which was largely engaging with Hannah's academic work. So the two of them will be talking about that. Before we dive into all those themes, love to hear just who you both are. So how about Mac, can you introduce yourself? And then Hannah, go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself as well.
Yeah, thanks, John. I'm Mac. I'm a lecturer on theology at Harvard Divinity School, where I got my PhD in theology, and I study far-right politics and Christian theology, particularly with a focus on the 20th century in Europe, in France and Germany. And so I'm very interested. I've learned a lot from Hannah's work on more contemporary far-right politics, and so I'm very excited to talk with her today.
And I'm Hannah. I'm very happy to be here. I'm senior lecturer in Bible politics and culture at Lund University, which is in the south of Sweden. I've been here for a couple of years working on a project on scripture and secularism. And yeah, recently published this book, The Bibles of the Far Right, which I'm very excited to be talking to you about.
Excellent. I'm just going to hand it over to the two of you. Mac, take it away, and I can't wait to hear what you all chat about.
Great. Well, Hannah, my article on your book was mostly about how contemporary American politicians use the Bible. Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, and your book is mostly about far-right politics in Europe, Northern Europe in particular, in Scandinavia. And so I was trying to kind of translate that work on the Bible and European far-right politics into the American right-wing politics context. But it's not a one-to-one comparison. Your book talks a lot about the status of religion in Northern Europe and the status of the Bible and its relationship to politics, which was really interesting as an American reader to read that description of how the Bible works politically and culturally in Northern Europe, because my sense is that in America, in American politics and culture, the Bible is much more central. You talk in your book about how people in Northern Europe a lot of them are coming to the Bible mainly through inspirational quotes on social media, images on clothing, kind of ideas circulating in the air, appeals to the Bible without a whole lot of depth behind them. And things are a little bit different in the States, where there's much more of a culture of people really seriously reading, studying the Bible, engaging with the Bible, and particularly like expecting of politicians to make some sort of connection between their own politics and the Bible, or to expecting politicians to kind of give an account of their relationship to the Bible. One of the things I talk about in the article was this very famous, very farcical moment in the 2016 election when Donald Trump was asked about the Bible. He was asked about his favorite book, and he said the Bible. And they said, "What's your favorite book in the Bible?" And he said, "Well, they're all great." Just classic Trump moment. But like that is a very kind of American thing of getting a politician and asking them to talk about their relationship to the Bible. So there's a real difference in how people are thinking about or expecting the Bible to function politically and culturally in the United States and in Northern Europe. And so like I said at the start, my article was kind of a first stab at trying to apply some of the lessons from your book to an American political context. But because you are the expert in your book, having written it, I'm mostly interested in hearing, well, what do you think about how some of the arguments that you make in your book connect to American politics from your perspective as a European yourself?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, I really enjoyed your engagement with my book in your article, particularly some of the examples, which I mean, are kind of grim and terrifying in some ways, but also slightly funny in a kind of dark way. But particularly, like you said, the kind of sort of, yeah, the Bible is such a great book. And I think it's interesting what you mentioned there about then the kind of non-specificity of that answer, and Trump having been pushed several times on kind of, well, which part of the Bible do you like the most? What's the best kind of text or verse or even testament, and him kind of being very resistant to be more specific, which is interesting. And I think that is actually, that point speaks to some of the similarities I think you see between some of the examples I talk about in Europe and in the US, because one of the difficulties with my book, I think, is what is it about geographically? I mean, you mentioned kind of Northern Europe, and that's true. You know, it's the starting point of the book is the far right inspired terrorist attacks in Norway in 2011. And that's, of course, a very concrete case. That's a concrete case with a specific perpetrator, victims, a sort of national context in Norway. But it's also an example of the kind of transnational spread of ideas that you see in that particular case in Norway more broadly. And that's why I wrote the book in a way, because I wanted to think about this concrete case, but the transnational trends and tendencies you see. So it ends up being a book which is sort of not really about Norway or Northern Europe or even Europe or the US, but kind of about all of these different geographical places, and none of them, you know, the way they kind of intersect and spread in terms of ideas and practices, the way literature is shared. Yeah, and then specifically then about the kind of use of the Bible and the way these things function across these different, very different domains. So you're absolutely right to kind of point to some key differences. And of course, if you kind of drill down into specific geographical or regional context, you see some real important contextual differences. But like I said, the transnational tendencies is in a way what I find most interesting and most kind of scary also now. And you see it now with concrete US politicians visiting Norwegian politicians or activists and sharing practices and ideas that are anti-immigrant. I mean, the kind of far right ideas that I focus on are those kind of extreme anti-immigrant sensibilities and the kind of Islamophobic, and that you certainly see all over, globally too, not just Europe and US. So there's that. There's kind of the transnational, and then there are these kind of concrete differences, and I think. I mean, there's some very interesting work. I mean, we're talking about my book, but there's some very interesting work being done in Oslo by a doctoral student there on kind of Trump and the Bible, which I'm very much looking forward to see, because I think that will help kind of bring out again a bit more concretely how some of the political practices around Trump and the Bible relate to the kind of practices I talk about. But Rebecca Carrera, who does this work in Oslo, I mean, she talks about the differences between primary, secondary, and tertiary references to the Bible in order to make sense of the US context. So kind of direct citations of the Bible, then the kind of secondary, which are biblical, but maybe less specific. You know, you might just say the Bible says, but you might say something about, you know, humans being made in the image of God. You're not quoting Genesis directly, but everyone who knows obviously that is actually from the Bible. And then the kind of tertiary, which might just be very vaguely biblical, like you might speak of Greta Thunberg as a prophet, or a storm being of biblical proportions. You know, these are much vaguer kind of biblical references. So I think that's interesting, the way you start to kind of differentiate between these different kinds of references, and that's perhaps where you might see that the kind of primary references in the US context differ from the kind of the references to the Bible that I mainly look at in my book. But I think what is common to both the European context and the US context would be basically when I refer to kind of biblical assemblages. So rather than talking just about what a biblical text means, how it's been interpreted, but really how a whole kind of a Bible is kind of construed by way of different assumptions and practices and ideologies and histories. And that's in a way, I think, pertinent and significant, whether you're just sharing an image on Instagram of a kind of Bible quote, or whether you're actually having an in-depth discussion about what Genesis 1:27 means. you're always kind of bringing with you a whole load of assumptions and ideas and histories and authorities into what you're kind of producing in terms of a biblical reception.
Yeah, so that is a good transition to another question that I wanted to ask you, which is kind of on the more, I guess, the more hopeful end of like, well, what is it possible to do about this? That I think like in the American context, if you're breaking it down, that primary, secondary, tertiary breakdown of it is really helpful. And it seems like maybe one of the differences between America and Europe when it comes to the Bible and politics is that America has a lot of and expects a lot more primary discussion of the Bible when it comes to politics than maybe in the European context where there's more of a tertiary element. And so one thing that I was wondering about, and that I left your book, even though your book is a pretty this is a compliment, a pretty grim and depressing read in a way because it's so informative. I left it with a slight hopeful note in that, okay, well, if this is how the Bible is functioning politically, if these far-right political actors are using the Bible in this way, then maybe one of the ways to resist these political projects is to use and to read and think about and discuss the Bible in different ways and in ways that cut against that, which got me thinking about Bible studies in the US. You talk about at the very end of your book, you talk about this Bible Lab project, which is a kind of experimental group. I don't even, it is sort of hard to describe. It's this kind of like groups getting together and thinking about the Bible, talking about the Bible, kind of unmaking it and remaking it in this very experimental, almost like performance art way, a kind of like amateur communal performance art piece. And so I was thinking, like, you kind of offer that as like one possible avenue for resisting far right uses of the Bible. Well, we can use it differently. And I was wondering about what lessons of those might be applicable to an American context where there's maybe more of an established culture of formal traditional group Bible study. There's a much higher percentage of people regularly attending church services and going to communal Bible studies. And so like this is not to put you on the spot and to have you, come up with a solution to our problems or something, but like if you could give advice to someone who is a member of an American Bible study about how to think more creatively about the Bible and to think about Bible use, to use your language, kind of what kind of tips would you give to someone who is involved in maybe a more traditional Bible study?
Well, I'm glad you found it kind of slightly hopeful, at least. Yeah, I mean, I was trying in the book to, in a way, not only offer kind of critical analysis, but also to think about, yeah, what do we do with this, while at the same time being humble about the fact that I don't have the solution to kind of, yeah, far right violence and racism. But that's why I was attracted to this idea of Bible Lab, which I get from. Erin Manning and Brian Masumi's kind of Sense Lab, which is a kind of art-based, yeah, project, and the idea to kind of experiment. And in a way, their motivation and mine is sort of how do you think about change? How does change come about? How does change occur? And to try and not think on that kind of macro level, like because how do we change something in some major way on a large scale? How can we think in a kind of more micro way about change? And I think there's something very attractive about this idea that yeah, you can collectively come together and experiment with the way kind of Bibles are construed. So I mean, again, I maybe as an academic, I veer into becoming more abstract again immediately. I was trying really hard to make it more kind of practical and practice based. But the idea, I guess, that might be a bit different from a Bible study. But I may also be wrong about how Bible studies traditionally function in the US. But I mean, the way I understand and know kind of Bible studies is, you get together as a group, normally a kind of Christian group or, in your congregation, and you read a particular biblical passage together or a couple of biblical passages. And the idea around Bible Lab is slightly different in that or kind of the way I've sort of thought it is, it's about thinking about major Bibles. How have particular understandings and uses of the Bible become dominant? And so I talk about the War Bible and the Civilization Bible as two examples of that. How do these major trends become kind of entrenched in particular ways? And how might specific groups come together to kind of challenge those dominant uses of the Bible? So that then has to come down from the kind of abstract into kind of, again, maybe reading particular biblical passages. But the whole idea in a way is the kind of experimentation, getting out of a kind of comfort zone of this is how we tend to read the Bible. This is who tends to talk about the Bible. These are the kinds of things we tend to say, to experiment with different formats. And maybe that means moving outside of kind of mono faith spaces. Again, of course, there's a long tradition of kind of interreligious dialogue. I'm not saying it's quite like that either, but I think fundamentally what it means is trying to experiment with or trying to recognize how do people with even the best intentions come to perhaps support or be complicit in particular kind of major Bibles and their kind of continued life. And how might we be part of kind of challenging those to think about who's excluded from that kind of Bible use, who's on the receiving end of discrimination as a result of the kinds of major biblical assemblages that operate.
Yeah, well, thank you, Hannah. That is good advice, and thank you also for a really incredible and informative book. I learned a lot reading it, and it's definitely going to be one that I return to as I try and think more about religion and politics today. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, thank you both. And anyone out there, if you missed Mac's article, the link will be in the video description below, along with the link to learn more about Hannah's book that we have been discussing here today. Thank you, Mac. Thank you, Hannah. Great conversation. And thanks everyone for being here.